Welcome to Chats with the Chief. I'm John Jensen, Chief of Staff at the Veterans Health Administration, and this is the podcast where we make small talk about the largest integrated healthcare system in the country. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Russ Huber, Army veteran and Director of the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Brain Bank at the VA Boston Healthcare System. Enjoy the show. Thanks for being here. Sure appreciate you being here, and we look forward to hearing a lot about you and what your work is. Before we get started, we always like to have a little bit of warm up, kind of talk about who you are so we can tell our audience about some great staff here in VA. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll jump into some really tough questions to start with.
All right. So I'm the director of the PTSD Brain Bank at the VA in Boston, and I guess what I do there is we receive brains from donors who are a part of our program, and then we store those brains. We do a dissection, and we then send some of that tissue out to other groups, and then we also do a lot of research ourselves on that tissue. A little bit about me, sort of stuff that I do. My background is I came from Santa Cruz, California. I grew up, that's a little surfer city right next to the water. And I spent my high school years there. And then after that, I went and joined the military. And then after the military, I came back, went to UC Santa Cruz, which was again in my hometown. And then finally after that, I went to do a PhD at the University of California in San Francisco in biophysics, where I studied X-ray crystallography, kind of an unusual field, but that's related to drug design, which is something I'm really interested in. And then after that, I went to medical school. I still hadn't had enough schooling at that point, so I decided to go to medical school, and I went to the Harvard HST program. And finally, I did residency, and residency was in the University of Washington. And then the job here opened up, and I jumped on it. So that's what led me here.
Oh, great. So some questions really to talk about, some people to help you understand a little bit more about your background. So what movie, book, or TV show are you watching or reading right now that other people would be really interested in?
Well, I'm a big science fiction fan, and so the movie, I guess the series that I've been watching a lot is The Expanse. It's kind of a sci-fi, I guess a set of episodes, and they've actually gotten pretty far. They've gotten a few seasons in, but with the COVID, this has been a good time for me to go ahead and catch up on all the episodes. And I think it's fascinating because it kind of juxtaposes people that live on Earth versus the people who live in space, and there's kind of a rich-poor aspect to it. It's a really interesting story. It's got kind of a political aspect to it, but it's very cool.
Great. Any books that you're reading?
Most of the books I read these days are pretty much technical manuals, okay. So not too much in the way of books.
Okay. Well, so any of those that you'd recommend I read?
If you like fluorescent microscopy, I have some titles for you.
Well, we can talk about that. Maybe you can help me. So is there a hobby or something that you like to do in your spare time when you're not working and investing all your time in the VA?
Well, before I got into medical school and things like that, one of the things I used to like to do was actually swing dancing. I was actually really good at that. I actually did swing dancing 3 to 4 times a week while I was in graduate school. More recently, again, my life kind of circles around the VA, and I guess perhaps what I do the most is probably barbecuing with the family, and I really enjoy that.
Great. Is there a saying or a poem or some statement that somebody's ever made to you that you've never forgotten, you kind of always fall back to all the time?
So one of the sayings that I think is important both for me now, but was also important in the military, was the idea that most limitations are self-imposed, or I guess the actual quote is all right. Limitations are self-imposed. But I really feel that having gone through the military and going through basic training, they really expose you to what you think are your limitations, and they kind of force you to see what's a real limitation versus what's something that you are imposing on yourself.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's a great saying. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit. So you have a very interesting kind of history or story, and you joined the military. What did you do in the military, and what kind of led you down that path and the path of your family, et cetera?
Well, there were kind of 2 reasons that I joined the military. The first one was that my family immigrated from Germany after the war. My great-grandfather was actually he was killed in the concentration camps, and he was because of that, my grandmother wanted to escape Germany, and then after the war, they were able to come here to America. And so I think, to some degree, I've always had this feeling like I sort of owed something to this country. I felt sort of I've been given so many great opportunities, so I wanted to give back something, and so that's one of the reasons I joined the military. But the other one was that at the time when I was younger, the Cold War was going on. And there was a very real fear that we would have some kind of a nuclear war or something like that in exchange. And I just felt like this was a good time for me to join the military. So I went ahead and joined the military. I think we were in the longest period of peace since Vietnam. And then when I got in, all of a sudden the conflict started. And so it was an interesting time to be in the military.
And so what did you do in the military?
I was anti-aircraft. I was a system called the Chaparral. And it's gone now. I think it's long gone. But our job was to protect the airbase against incoming aircraft, and so that's what I did while I was there. I remember during the first Persian Gulf conflict, all the F-15s flying off to Iraq. It was pretty crazy time.
Yeah. Did you serve in Desert Storm?
I did not serve in Desert Storm. I was in Germany the whole time.
Okay.
They just needed the aircraft. They didn't need the air defenders.
I got it. So they did have Chaparral systems actually when I was in Desert Storm. I remember.
Oh, did they?
It's guarding the bases there. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
I guess they didn't need us. They didn't need our unit.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then, so you served in the military, and then you went back home, and you told your story a little bit about how you went to a significant amount of schooling. So how long have you been with the VA, and how long have you been here in the Boston healthcare system?
So I've been with the VA, let's see, I would say about 8 years now, I guess 4 or 5 here, and then 3 years before that I was at the VA in Washington. I went through the residency at the University of Washington, and then I continued on. I worked with a PTSD group there and did a fellowship there, so I've actually been working kind of in this line for some time now.
So your research that you do and where you work now at the PTSD Brain Bank, can you maybe describe a little bit about that was? You kind of touched on that a little bit in your introduction, but really what is it that you're looking to find and do with the brains that are affected with PTSD?
So when we collect the brains, we collect both halves of the brain, and one half we usually fix, and then we can do studies on that with a fixed half, and then there's another half that we actually freeze. And the reason that we do that is because the fixed half, it maintains the structure, and we can do a lot of structural studies, which is my area of interest. And then the other half is frozen, and we can do molecular studies. And I think that the molecular studies are something that offers a lot of kind of hope for veterans now, because we're beginning to understand the actual kind of molecular mechanisms that underlie PTSD. And in fact, our group recently published some great research on the genetics and the genome. We're looking at the transcriptomics, which is the expression levels of proteins in brains, and we're doing this in all different regions of the brain. So we have the capacity to do a lot of research that beforehand we wouldn't have been able to do. Again, my area is more structural. I'm a neuropathologist, so we're trying to see in these brains, is there some other kind of neuropathology besides PTSD, like Alzheimer's, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and then of course Parkinson's disease. So the common neurodegenerative diseases, and see if there's a comorbidity between the two.
And so where do you get the brains for the brain bank?
We actually have a lot of different avenues in which the brains can come to us. We have an ante-mortem program, which is obviously living donors that make it clear that they want to be part of the study, and so we follow them throughout their lifetime. So from when they come in and just all the way until they pass, and then we also then ask their family to make sure that they want this donation. And then once we have the brain, then that's one source, and I'd say that's where most of our new brains are coming from. We also have a certain number that come in through a postmortem channel, which is through medical examiners and other places where we have an agreement with them that if they have a PTSD person, that they'll ask the family if they're willing to allow us to do the work. And then finally, we also have a collaboration with another Lieber Institute, and we had a large infusion of brains initially, which is what we've started our work with. One interesting aspect of this is that we've partnered with other organizations. We work with Pink Concussions, and they have brought along a number of people who have joined our study, and that of course is particularly females, and which is nice because our study actually has a large number of females. And that's important because you would think that PTSD is primarily military, but actually the prevalence of PTSD is more like 9% in women and only about 6% in men. So it's important to realize it's important both for the military and the civilian population.
And so you find some commonalities in there in your research and your study between the brains, not only from the military but from outside the military, men and women, et cetera?
We do. So there's a number of different levels of research that are going on. When I talk about the neuropathologies, PTSD itself doesn't have a designated neuropathology. If I look at a tissue from someone who has PTSD under the scope, I'm not going to see something. But they have a much higher chance of, I shouldn't say a much higher, but a higher chance of developing Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, twofold risk for Alzheimer's, threefold risk for Parkinson's disease. And so I can find those kinds of pathologies underneath a microscope.
So can you maybe talk a little bit about the different ways that you're able to, I guess, see that or diagnose that inside of a brain?
Sure, yeah. So as I was mentioning, we have the fixed half of the brain. And so we'll take very small pieces of tissue from that fixed half. We put it in wax, and then we cut really thin sections of it, and then we use special stains. And so we have general stains, which just help us see the structure. And then we have specific ones like tau and amyloid, and those help us to distinguish different types of neurodegenerative diseases. And that's the basic neuropathology. There's a lot of extensions of that we're doing in terms of research. One of the things that's my own area of interest is where we clear the tissue, and then we can do actual, it's called clarity, and we can look deep into the tissue and make these 3D reconstructions of the tissue. But it's the same kind of thing, but it's very advanced, and the VA has been very generous in terms of helping us with that research.
That's great. So what causes PTSD, and I guess how does that help you in looking what you're looking at and the research you're doing?
Right. Well, I think PTSD obviously has been around for as long as people have been traumatizing one another. But I think where the study of PTSD really started was after World War I, where people realized that when you were getting shelled repeatedly and you couldn't get away, that is the situation that causes PTSD. It's basically when you're under stress and you don't have any control over it. And so that's what starts it. And then we found throughout the wars that actually the most recent conflicts where people were being shelled and also exposed to IEDs also has a tendency to produce PTSD. So those are the kinds of things that generate PTSD. There's also there's an area of research that a lot of people are working on right now, which is that there's also usually some kind of trauma that's associated with it. You know, exposure to blast, just repetitive hits, those kinds of things, and the intersection between that and sort of the psychological and the physical. And so we're trying to understand those things, but it's a very complicated picture, but it's I think really helped by the tissue.
You mentioned before a little bit about kind of the correlations with Alzheimer's, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, the differences between PTSD, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, et cetera. I guess how those things maybe increase the likelihood of getting Parkinson's and or Alzheimer's.
Yeah, so when we've done studies looking at the I guess the risk that you would have for developing Alzheimer's disease, the chance is roughly 2 times, or you double your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease when you have a history of PTSD. You actually triple your risk of getting Parkinson's disease when you have a history of that. And you also, ALS is another thing that there's also a heightened chance for PTSD and also for trauma. So all of these processes appear to kind of go down the same pathway, which is potentiate the development of these diseases. And one interesting thing that we find is that in our cases that are part of the CTE brain bank is that many of those brains actually have multiple neurodegenerative processes going on at the same time, which is kind of unusual. Usually you expect to find Alzheimer's alone, but we might find multiple things going on at once.
Interesting. So PTSD is curable, is it not?
It is in many cases. Many people recover from it just as time goes by, but there are people that have they don't recover from it. And for those folks, we really hope that some of the research we're doing will help us understand the molecular pathways, and maybe we can develop drugs. I think there's a lot of cognitive therapies that people are going through and things like that, and they have some degree of success. But there are still some people that have these very difficult cases of PTSD.
You mentioned before about tau. Maybe you could describe a little bit of what that is and kind of what that does.
Okay. Well, in a normal brain, tau is necessary. The skeleton of a neuron basically has these microtubules, and tau is something that binds to them and stabilizes them, and also tells motors which ways to go up and down the axons. In neurodegenerative conditions, what happens is the tau, instead of doing its normal role, it starts to kind of glom together, and you get these aggregates. And when they get big enough, you end up with what's called a neurofibrillary tangle. And so that's a neuron that has this big chunk of tau in it. And our understanding of neurodegenerative diseases, if you look at Alzheimer's disease as sort of the prototype there, if you follow the progression of this tau pathology, it also follows with people's development of cognitive difficulties. So as it goes farther along through the brain, they have more and more cognitive difficulties. And that's one of the few proteins where we can really trace it as it goes through, and it definitely correlates.
It's fascinating that you're able to figure this out. Is this kind of the work that you felt that you would be doing when you first came to the VA?
When I came to the VA, yes. When I was younger, I didn't know. But when I got to the VA, I started with neuropathology, and this was back at the University of Washington. And then I had the opportunity to work in a lab where we were doing experiments on BLAST. And then basically my interest in neuropathology and then the work I did with BLAST naturally just kind of went into this direction. BLAST is highly correlated with PTSD, so there's definitely a relationship between the two.
And you think about BLAST, I often think about traumatic brain injury and what's the kind of the correlation between TBI and PTSD, or maybe some descriptions on that.
Well, so one of the things that we're studying is CTE as well, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and what seems to cause that is repetitive hits. And they don't have to necessarily be fully concussive, it's just repetitive hits over a long period of time, and that seems to be what generates the pathology. We think that there's similar things that are going on in people with PTSD, but one of the differences, there have been a number of structural studies, and that we find that certain areas of the brain are preferentially affected. It looks like the amygdala, which is part of the fear response network, and then also the hippocampus, which is your memory center, and then part of the frontal cortex, which is kind of the area that modulates behavior. And all three of those areas seem to be affected by PTSD in terms of those areas become smaller. There's some atrophy that occurs in those structures. So that's what we've been seeing with our structural studies, and now we're doing that with a microscope to see what that means at the microscope level or microscopic level.
So what do you, you mentioned lots of things about, the effects of PTSD and I guess kind of how it looks, but what's the relationship between PTSD and neuroinflammation? Yeah,
so it's an interesting thing with neuroinflammation because you need neuroinflammation. Well, the same cells that are involved with neuroinflammation are also involved with tending your synapses. So if you look in the brain, there's a certain cell called a microglia, and this is an inflammatory cell, and under normal circumstances, its job is to go in and prune synapses, so the connections between the neurons. And it actually will go in there and prune them. And there's a saying in neurology, which is that basically neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that if they're firing at the same time, they're part of the same pathway. And so the microglia will prune the ones that are not part of these pathways. Now, what we're finding with people who have neuroinflammation, these microglia are not working correctly. And if you have a neuroinflammatory insult, what will happen is those microglia will go and just start stripping all the synapses. And so that's obviously not a good thing. So we're trying to understand that. And it also appears that as people get older, the cells that are part of their inflammatory system, the neuroinflammatory system, become kind of constitutively inflammatory, so they're always a little bit inflammatory. And so we're trying to understand why that is and then what effect that has. Definitely with PTSD, there's this kind of constant firing that's going on. And so the brain remodels to deal with that. And that's what we're trying to understand.
Wow. How many brains are in the brain bank, and how many brain banks are there?
So let me answer the second question first. There's 8 brain banks that we have in the Boston area. And those brain banks are actually still attached to other brain banks which supply us. But the main ones that are at the VA are going to be the PTSD brain bank, the ALS Brain Bank, the Gulf War Syndrome Brain Bank, and trying to remember, I think there's one more. And then there's some other brain banks that we share with the Boston University, and that's going to be like the Alzheimer's Disease Center, the CTE Brain Bank, the Centenarian Study, which is studying these people that live very, very long. And so all of those brain banks work together, and that gives us a much broader base of brains to look at. Now, the PTSD Brain Bank itself has around 280 brains right now that it's collected over time, and probably 180 of those were from Lieber, and then the rest were ones that we've collected since then. So we have actually quite a selection at this point. And again, I want to mention that we have the largest collection of female brains, which is something that a lot of the brain banks can't say.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about the Centenarian study, and I'd heard about that as well. So maybe you can describe that for the audience and tell us kind of what that's looking at.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons that we're really interested in these people that age. They age well, right? So they're out in the hundreds usually, centenarian. And what we're looking for is, do these people already have some kind of pathology? And we do find that they do have pathology. They have a little bit of tau, and it's actually in the same structures that eventually are involved by like Alzheimer's and things like that, the hippocampus basically. Interestingly enough, though, in these cases that live really, really long like that, a lot of times the pathology is still quite minor. And so we would really like to understand that. It's resiliency. Why are these people so resilient? Is there some way that we can utilize that knowledge to make therapies? Is there some way that we can alter behavior that would help people live longer? So those are the big questions. But it is fascinating that that they still develop pathology, but they are resilient for whatever reason.
That's amazing. I look forward to seeing and understanding that a little bit more. What other studies are you working on, or is the VA working on, when it comes to brains?
Well, all the brain banks that I mentioned there are studies going on in those different areas. A lot of the work that I do is also with the Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Brain Bank, and then also with the Alzheimer's Disease Center. And the reason for that is because I'm very interested in what PTSD becomes. Does it become Alzheimer's? Does it become Parkinson's disease? And I just want to see what the connections are between those things and what pathways are shared between those. So that's the stuff that I'm most focused on. Again, I'm doing a lot of this structural work where we're clarifying the tissue and looking at the different pathological molecules, but also how the cells are reacting to those pathologies. So it's really, really fascinating stuff.
It really is fascinating. So I'm curious from a layman's point. What does like a normal day look like for you, if there is a normal day?
It is. It's hard to say that I have a normal day, but let's say a case comes in. If a case comes in, then we will meet in our morgue area, which is really just for brains. We don't do the full body examination, and then we would set up for doing that. I would work with a technician. We go through, we film everything, or we document all of our work. We take half of the brain, and like I said, we freeze it. We cut it into thin sections so that it can freeze very quickly, because we want to preserve the molecules. And then we put the other half in fixative. And that process probably takes about 2 hours to get, from beginning to end, depending on who's doing it. If I'm doing it, it's about 2 hours. If our pro sector does it, then it's very quick. He can get it in about an hour and a half. And then after that, I'm usually looking at cases. Okay. So we have a lot of cases that come in, so I have to do a full neuropathological examination. That usually takes 3 to 4 hours per case of just going through, because you have to scan the slides and look at all of it so that you're not missing anything. And then we also have teams of people that are doing researchers. So I'm usually meeting with the people that I do research with. We have a big area where we have all the fancy microscopes that we work on. So I'm oftentimes interacting with the person that operates those microscopes, and we're just going over images and talking about that. So that's pretty much what an average day would be, I would say. But again, there's not really an average day.
Sure, I'm sure. Not when you're looking at brains. And,
right.
Yeah, everything's a little bit different, I'm sure. Each case is a little bit different.
It is, yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the opportunities for research in the VA, maybe compared to other places in this community, but in any community, actually. And there's so many great things we do in research. Maybe you could talk a little bit about it from your perspective.
Well, the VA, presuming you're working on something that is interesting to the VA, there's a lot of support for researchers. One of the things I think is really great about the VA is that they do put a lot of effort and a lot of resources into getting your project started. So if you're a new starting off researcher and you start working at the VA, there's first of all, there's usually lots of equipment that's shared. So you have the equipment you need to do the research just coming in, and they also will make sure that they get equipment for your particular projects. There are a lot of grants that you have access to that other people don't. So it's a nice way to get started, and a lot of these grants are sort of aimed at getting you to the point where you can start interacting with the NIH and get bigger grants. And so again, the VA, it's a very fruitful area for someone who's starting out and getting into research. And then of course for established researchers is a good place too.
Yeah, lots of great opportunities here. Well, Dr. Huber, we've come to the end of our time, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to close or offer any thoughts to the audience about the great work that you do or the great work that's happening here in the Boston healthcare system.
Well, the one thing I'd just like to say is anyone who's considering, donating their brain, we really need these donations. It's really important, the research. What we're finding here will help other veterans, and it will go beyond the VA. It's going to help other people outside the VA. So we're really grateful for all of the donations we've received, but we really hope that other people will become aware of the program and want to be part of it.
Well, it's great you being here. It's been great hearing about your work and hearing about your life and your dedication to veterans. And thanks again for joining us, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thanks again. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. A huge thank you to all of you for listening, to Dr. Huber for his time, Diz and One for hosting us, and our broadcast and production team for their support. See you next time.